A little bit about how does a church maintain any kind of stability in a process of growth? And what does a church do to continue to build structures and processes and ways of being together that helps us live out our values no matter what the size of the church and how the church develops and grows? How do we maintain who we think we've been called to be in the middle of change and growth? Um, well, first, I just want to say we just believe that every church should be a growing church. We never want to put a sign on the door that says, "Sorry, we're full. You can go to hell." And I mean that exactly the way I say it. For a church to not want to grow is pretty much saying, "Yeah, we don't really care about the watching world. We don't care about people that don't have any life with Jesus. Sorry, we're full. We're closed for business. We're just happy to be with one another." And so we're going to say up front, we believe that healthy churches want to grow. Now, growing can happen a number of different ways. It need not be that it grows forever exponentially, but maybe it grows through multiplication, more than one church working together, or planting churches, maybe within the same city, or planting different types of churches, even within a church. We have young adults and youth, and we're doing things with kids, and we're doing things with empty nesters, and even doing that in different places in a city or all together in one place are ways of multiplying growth. But it's necessary, important that to be a church that's joining with what God is doing in the world, that we believe that we want to and will continue to grow. So, how do we maintain some kind of stability as we grow? How do we keep a personal touch, right? Just because you're a small church doesn't mean there's a great personal touch, just so you know. There's large churches that have a great personal touch and ways to connect people. And there's small churches that become insular and really strange, and you can't. So it isn't just about size, but how do you have personal touch as you continue to grow? How do you give practical coping mechanisms for life? The more we're going along in culture, the more we're seeing that the job of the church seems to increasingly be that we help people with normal parts of their life. We take on more and more of a parenting role, not just a role to help people think spiritually about their life. That with the breakdown of family and the needs that people have in their life, they need ways to cope with their money and with their sex life and with parenting and with marriage and any number of things. So how do we continue to do that even as the church grows? And also we have to find ways to keep, people using their different gifts and what they're called to. How do we make it so it isn't just everybody watching the same 5 to 10 people using their gifts, but how, as the scriptures say, everyone's called and gifted and equipped. How can they continue to use their gifts accordingly? How can we use diverse gifts within the church, not just the ones that we kind of see on a stage? And then how do we continue to grow and develop and change where we can develop diversity in every way, from young to old? So age diversity and racial diversity. Diversity across languages and racial diversity across socioeconomic statuses. How do we continue to do that? And as we grow, you kind of get more opportunities to do that, but then it's also a challenge because you have to have structures that enable you to take on all the things that the kingdom affords you the opportunities toward. But then also we have to be the kind of church that fosters accountability and real change and mutual submission, that we want to see people keep transforming and growing and becoming more like Jesus. And on it goes. I could talk to you about all the different things we want to be as a church that takes on the issues of justice and is invested in the city. And all of these things are all happening, and it requires that we're thoughtful about processes in the life of the church and how each stage of a church affords new opportunities and new challenges. So what are the stages of church growth? I like to think about this maybe in terms of like animals. There's different sized animals in the world. Maybe you would have like a mouse versus a cat versus a dog versus like a really big dog, maybe a horse or an elephant. Each of these animals have different sizes, different opportunities, but yet they also they have different structures that enable them to live certain ways. Let's say a mouse might be a church of 5 to 35 people. And that structure doesn't need a lot. Maybe just only needs one volunteer leader that will help teach and lead and coordinate and keep everybody's information in a database, stuff like that, right? Really simple stuff. But as that church grows to be maybe 75 people, now that volunteer leader might need to maybe look more like a pastor, a generalist pastor, maybe even a part-time pastor who's learning to preach and to teach and to sort of pull things together and provide different kinds of care. Now, if that church grows to be about 200 people, now you need, you for sure need a full-time generalized pastor, right? That's 150 to 200 people. They're preaching, they're teaching, they're leading, they're thinking theologically, they're building certain kinds of structures and classes. And by the way, in the United States right now, 93% of churches are under 200 people. And the reason they're under 200 people is because sociologically, right about this size, people don't want to grow anymore. Usually have a general pastor and then a few maybe volunteer leaders that help maybe with pieces of the church. And then for the church to grow beyond that, it's going to require some shifts that frankly most people just sociologically aren't prepared to do. It'd be too costly, it'd be too painful, it'd be too difficult to change the way that the church functions in order to do that. And that's why 93% of churches are under 200 people. Actually, the median-sized church in America is about 65 to 70 people. So, anyway, all that's to say, the large churches push the average way up, but the majority of churches are under 200 people. And it's because they get right in this area where they have a generalized pastor. And here's the truth. Usually that's because the pastor themselves wants to still be everybody's friend and lead everything, and or doesn't really have the gifts to lead teams that might grow the church. But if a church wants to grow over 200 people, maybe to 400 or 800 people, that general pastor is then going to have to hire specialized pastors and or program staff. You're going to have to get staff that lead specific parts of the church, maybe a worship leader, a kids coordinator. That isn't going to be able to be a volunteer. It's going to have to be a paid position because it's going to take so many hours because there's going to be so many kids or so much complicated stuff to do with worship because you have multiple teams, or maybe they're an outreach coordinator. Who knows? That maybe they're just an assistant pastor, an executive pastor. There's enough to do with budget and timelines and money and goals that, man, there's so much to do with the whole church. We have to do all these different kinds of things. So now you're hiring specialists, and then volunteers are filling in around that. And then we could talk about a huge mega church. That's 5,000, 10,000 people. You have all kinds of layers. You pretty much have a church that runs the whole church. You have a staff of 100 or 200 people from full and part-time positions. But each of these requires that the structure changes in order to accommodate the organism. Now, for an elephant to give birth to an elephant, it takes a long time. But for a mouse to give birth to other mice, it's actually not that long, and they give birth to a bunch. Now a bunch die. So each of these different animals has the ability to take over the biosphere if they want to, but there's going to be different times because the complexity is different. It costs more money. There's more challenges. There's greater opportunities with a large church to do bigger impact things in a city. But then there's also, it's a little more cumbersome to try to make changes and adapt and flex and flow. So within each of these shifts, it's really important that as a church gets larger, a church gets smaller. So at every stage, the church is asking questions about how do we create environments where people are connecting in those 8 to 10 windows, on service teams, in small groups, in coaching relationships. In our churches, we've historically called these circles, that we say that life with God is meant to be lived in circles, not in rows, meaning that in rows on a Sunday you sit and you learn and you grow, and we love what we do on Sunday. But if that's the only way you grow in your life with God, you're not going to really grow. You don't get to know one another. You don't get to pray for one another. You don't get to hear each other's stories. You don't get to serve with one another and go through the hard things and the different stages of life together. And so in other words, you're always trying to make a large church small. And so even for you, as you're thinking about leading in the life of a church, are you connected in circles, and are you committed to be the kind of person that leads certain kind of circles? Even if you're caring for kids in our kids' church, or if you're on a worship team, to see, no, we're here to pastor one another, to learn from one another, to pray for one another, and to live a life that's smaller for the sake of the whole of what God wants to do in the church. Listen, learning to lead this way is the way to grow healthy leaders. That we're not just looking for gifted and talented leaders that we can put on stages to do cool stuff to run big things, but it creates effectively a homegrown system where people grow up in the life of the church, caring for one another, learning to teach in a small group, learning to pray in a small group, learning to worship in small groups, on small teams, in coaching relationships, because it enables us then to grow up in a healthy way that shifts who we become over time. It also enables us to absorb new guests more effectively. That we're not just building systems where we're trying to get people through stuff, but that each little circle within the life of a church is looking to engage new people and help bring them into the life of the church. Then it means that, well, the fruit remains in the life of the church. Now, in our church, no matter what the size of our church, we're going to continually build processes to help people move into life with God. We have classes. We have ways that guests can come and be a part of dinners. We have things like this right now. We're doing something. We're talking about how do we lead in our church? Things that we used to do maybe around a coffee, across a coffee table when a church is 50 people, we're now doing through a video or through some writing. But none of those processes, listen to me, none of those processes can replace personal connections. We build processes so that we can keep values going and enable more people to participate, but it all has to land somewhere where we connect, we pray, we serve, we do the things that we're supposed to do with one another, because in the end, that's what's going to make us a healthy group of people together. I pray that as God calls you to lead in a community, no matter how large the church, no matter how large the organization, you keep finding the small ways that you do the little things. But that you also realize that it's going to have to change if it continues to grow. That those processes are built in order to facilitate healthy growth. You have to hire and structure differently so that we can continue to make room for more, to continue to multiply, so we get bigger and smaller all at the same time.